when you look at social media, it seems like it's propagated by conservative thought leadership. Of course, there's the right wing conspiracy, which is just part of it. But when you look at sort of the most popular shares on Facebook, it seems to be conservative thought or right wing politics in a big way. Why is that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that is a function of the fact that social media networks have historically optimized for user engagement. And one great way to keep your user base sharing, retweeting, liking, and posting is to incite strong emotion. And that can come from stoking outrage, a sense of tribalism. It's always easier, right, to put out a simple story about your enemy, say, than to get into the nuances that sometimes politics requires. And I think we've seen the same thing happen with misinformation and conspiracy theories. The misinformation around Stop the Steal is a great example of that.
So why is that? Why aren't progressives emotional or big in terms of social media? Or how do you see that dichotomy?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that it's not that progressives couldn't be, and maybe they'll figure out a way to do that. But I think conservatives have been very savvy around using these engagement algorithms to their advantage. In terms of seeing what kind of content gets the strongest response, and then pushing that kind of content in their networks. And then there's that natural amplification effect from the social media networks and their algorithms. So it's sort of a self-reinforcing cycle.
So you reported in December about Facebook changing some of its algorithms to around racial bias. Like, can algorithms sort of change things, or will they change things, or is it human intervention? To take out things, misinformation in particular.
Right. So, one of the things we reported in December was about Facebook changing its algorithms around hate speech. And I think that's a really good example of that shows like the interplay between humans and technology. It's important to remember that it is, humans who write these algorithms, who develop the technology, decide what the priorities are, and, decide what policies get enforced. So I think it's twofold. You cannot, as we've seen, as companies have tried to use technology to scale their content moderation efforts, that human intervention is necessary. Some of the decisions around hate speech and violence, especially when you're talking about global platforms with billions of users, require a knowledge of a particular culture or the ability to read something in context. But in Facebook's case, the changes that they made in December were just to start prioritizing or thinking about focusing on the worst of the worst content, the most offensive hate speech. And the fact that they're not doing this until December 2020 shows you that, human intervention plays a big role in what the technologies are capable of doing.
So I wanted to ask, as a follow-up, the suspension of Trump's Facebook for a while, his banning from Twitter. Um, Observing the valley as you do from out there, what has made this happen to transpire now? Is it just the scale of the violence and the revulsion by management about what's happened? Is it pressure from employees or advertisers? Or, as you've reported, to some degree, a calculated change with the Democrats coming into power who are more inclined towards regulation? How do you see this?
Right. Well, I think it's a very important context to note that incitement to violence is one of the few clear lines across different social media networks of, things that violate their rules of what you can post. So it has always been the case that this, the type of content that Trump is now being sanctioned for was against the rules. It's just that the rules were not enforced against him. If you look at like this past summer during the Black Lives Matters protests, when Trump posted on Facebook that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. I think that is a clear incitement to violence and something that Facebook employees and critics had pointed out to Mark Zuckerberg, but they chose not to enforce it. So what was different this time? I think it's a manifold of factors. Many of the ones that you mentioned, I think, you can't discount the fact that some of these decisions, like Twitter's decision to label Trump and to give him that initial temporary ban, was happening as the violence on the attack on the Capitol was ongoing. We had all learned pretty early on that that one woman was dead, and there was not a clear sense of, how much more violence there would be. I think another strong tipping point was the fact that there's an expiration date on Trump's power and his term as an elected official. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, has often used the defense of the exceptions that Twitter gave Trump as, what he would say is that, this is a global leader of the free world. People need to know what he is saying, what he's doing, what he's thinking. And that was soon up. I think that the fact that the attack was happening to affect elected officials who were already, increasing their rhetoric around the desire to enforce against these companies and make sure that they are obeying the law. I mean, all of those things coalesced into one. And last but not least is internal pressure from employees. Twitter, the Twitter employees, hundreds of Twitter employees signed a letter to Jack Dorsey telling him that, they understood the challenges that the company had faced over the past few years, but watching the actions during the attack on the Capitol, something changed. The lack of transparency, Twitter's clear culpability in the event. They wanted him to permanently suspend the account. So I think that employee pressure, both inside Facebook and inside Twitter, certainly played a factor.
So Twitter without Donald Trump is definitely different. How do you see that changing, for Twitter in terms of, and I'm sure there's a lot of people are upset about it, as you know, particularly on the right. And there's some potential tomorrow on Monday when there could be some kind of regulatory action. We don't know. But how does it, does it change Twitter, or does it make it more political? Does it make it more attractive to advertisers or less? Or do you see any sort of impact on Twitter by banning permanently Donald Trump?
First of all, it is an unprecedented situation. It kind of remains to be seen. I think one thing that's interesting, given Trump's and his supporters, the very strong backlash against the fact that he was banned from the service, shows, and the fact that he hasn't come up with an alternative yet. I mean, Trump has mentioned, being in negotiations with alternative social networks, a strong preference for perhaps having his own site or his own app, which is something that his former campaign advisor, Brad Parscale, had recommended. And, we hear that there might be some developments on that front. But I think the fact that, it's been a few days and we haven't heard yet where he might end up shows that it's really hard to replicate the amplification and the reach of these dominant social networks like Twitter and Facebook. I think you've perhaps also heard about Parler, which is one alternative, which was recently Amazon, Apple, and Google have taken action against the company for inappropriate content moderation, insufficient content moderation. And so there's a possibility that once it beefs up those content moderation efforts, it'll be back in play. But early on, most of what you heard about Parler, the reason that it's become a little bit more mainstream is because you probably heard about it on Twitter from various regulators who are continuing to tweet through this, this kind of stronger action that we've seen from companies in banning QAnon accounts along with Donald Trump's account. So I think that, it's just oftentimes kind of wrapped into an antitrust issue of, can you really have an alternative that can compete with Twitter or Facebook? And I think the answer right now is not yet.